Chapter 21. Luli. Luli saw Kadir's fire first, a bright, nearly blue flame that flickered fiercely in the distance. It was the single guiding light in this pitch-black sandstorm. She rode toward it, stopping only when her horse's hooves clicked rather than crunched. Then Kadir was at her side, leading her horse into the cave. She cursed as she unwrapped the shawls from around her face. Her eyes burned like hell, and there was sand in her teeth. Kadir wordlessly handed her the water skin as she dismounted, and she drenched both her face and her throat with water before shaking off a thick layer of dust that had settled onto her clothing. "No sand in your lungs?" Kadir said. She coughed, only little more than usual. Not long after Kadir tethered her horse, the prince entered the cave through a curtain of dark sand. Her eyes were cracked with red as he slid off his saddle and unwound his scarves. Luli expected a smirk, but not the haunted look on his face. "Has Aisha arrived?" he asked. Luli glanced at Kadir, who shook his head. The prince cursed. "I lost her in the storm." Though he had made the proclamation calmly, Luli saw his panic in the way his throat bobbed and in the way he looked not once, but twice over his shoulder, as if he expected his admission to summon the thief. Before Luli could say anything, he went to stand at the cave entrance. Sand assaulted him from various directions, but the prince stood tall as he stared out into the dark void that had become the desert. "Gods," she heard him murmur. She was taken aback by the emotion in his voice. "We'll search for her after the storm clears." Kadir approached the prince's horse and patted the dirt from its muzzle. The prince whirled. "But Aisha bint Luath..." He looked at a loss for words. She almost felt sorry for him. Mostly, though, she was disappointed that he too had not disappeared, that she could not lose him and flee this terrible quest. Abruptly, as if he realized he'd let his mask fall, he turned away from the entrance and sighed. "Fine. We wait for the storm to clear." And wait they did. When evening came, they broke bread over the fire and took turns watching the mouth of the cave. There was barely any conversation between them, and Luli was glad for it. She did not want to talk about the lost thief, and she did not want to talk about Dime again, especially when the topic was Ahmed. She had been trying to forget him since he was mentioned last night, but now the conversation was etched into the back of her mind. A reminder that she too would have to visit him. A reminder that for all her convoluted feelings about the Wali, she wanted to visit him. Luli absently turned to over in her head. It faded only when she slept once more, dissipating into a problem to be addressed later. Always later. The storm did not subside until early morning, at which point they packed their supplies and left to search for the missing thief. Luli assumed that Aisha had found refuge in some other place, but she saw nothing nearby that would pass for shelter. There was also no sign of her horse. Luli thought about using the compass to track her, but ultimately decided against it. She did not want to reveal its magic to the prince. He was a thief, after all, and she did not think it beneath him to steal it. Retracing their steps from the previous day was impossible. The storm had covered their tracks completely. It was impossible to tell where they had lost Aisha. Except for the occasional cactus or shrub, the desert was just a landscape of rolling dunes, steep valleys, and squat cliffs. Only nearby civilization was Dime, which seemed further than it had yesterday. It was nothing but a speck on the horizon, visible only when they gained elevation. Luli groaned as they passed a scraggly yellow scrub they had most certainly walked past earlier. Perhaps she should use the compass. "I think I see another cave in the distance," Kadir said. He pointed, and though Luli saw nothing but smudges, the smudges were gray in color, and that was promising in a landscape of golds and reds. "I'll ride out and check." He looked at her and raised a brow. "Wait for me," the look said. Luli hesitated. She and Prince Omar, alone? The thought made her nervous. Not because she was scared of him, no, but because she abhorred the idea of having to exist in the same space with him without Kadir. But she cast a surreptitious look at the prince. He was sullen, lips pressed together in a grimace that was more anxious than angry. "He is tolerable like this," she thought, and nodded at Kadir to say so. The minute Kadir took off, the prince slid from his saddle and began climbing the nearest hill of sand. Luli frowned at him. "What are you doing?" "Trying to get a vantage point." He hesitated as the sand shifted beneath his feet. then turned to look at her expectantly. Luli bristled. She refused to be looked down on, figuratively or literally. Her legs were sore by the time they reached the top, but she was reinvigorated by the view. To the east, the shadow that was the city of Dime, and to the west, she saw a speck that was Kadir. He was heading for the gray smudge, which from here she could see was indeed a cave. In the distance, she saw a line of shadows that might have been a caravan, but they were too far out for Aisha to have reached in a single night. Luli glanced down. The hill they were on dropped into a small, steep valley on this side, once surrounded by slopes of sand. It was a spectacular, if eerie, sight. I see something, the prince mumbled. He pointed and Luli followed his gaze to a sliver of color below them. From this distance, it looked like a crumpled shadow without an owner. Luli slid down into the valley ahead of him to investigate. She dug through the sand to unearth the shard of color. Her heart dropped as she held it up. It was a velvet scarf. Omar snatched the lightweight cloth from her hands. This looks like one of Aisha's. Luli stood and glanced around them. If this scarf was one of the thieves, and it was here beneath the dunes, did that mean she had stumbled into this valley, or had the wind simply carried it here? Beside her, Omar inhaled sharply. He whirled in place, eyes narrowed. What is that? His gaze seemed oddly unfocused. Infernal sound? Luli strained her ears, but all she could hear was the distant cry of a hawk. There's a voice. Omar stepped toward the dune. He paused, tilted his head. A woman's voice. He pressed his palm to the gigantic hill of sand. For a moment, he just stood there, squinting. Then he began to claw at the dirt. Luli stepped back, away from the falling dust. Ah, what a great idea, High Prince. I had not even considered the possibility of Aisha burying herself in the sand. The prince just kept digging like a man possessed, sending more dust at her face. She gasped. A terrible idea. She inhaled a fistful of sand and choked on her own breath. By the time the air cleared, her throat was on fire. She spun on High Prince, a curse on her lip, but it died in the same breath. Despite all the falling sand, the dune looked exactly as it had moments ago. And Omar was gone. She half expected him to jump out at her, but no such thing happened, and the prince did not respond when she called his name. Magic? There was only one way to find out. She reached into her robe and pulled out the compass. She knew, even before looking at the arrow, what it would show her. The instrument was humming the way it did every time an undiscovered relic was close. Sure enough, the red arrow was pointing straight at the wall of sand, quivering as if with anticipation. Luli eyed the dune warily. It was not rare for a relic to manipulate the space around it. The stronger the relic, the more powerful the manipulation. But a dune? She put her hand to the hill and startled when her rings warmed. Indecision seized her as she looked at the compass. She had never gone searching for a relic without Kadir, had never left him without a way to find her. But I just need to grab the prince and get out. I'll be back before Kadir returns. She tucked the compass into her pocket and stepped forward. This time, the magic did not hide itself from her. The sand gave away, revealing an entrance that hadn't been there before. Luli stepped into the darkness and disappeared from the valley.